Have you ever wondered why humans became this way? Not just smart, plenty of animals are clever. Not just social, even ants have societies. But self-aware, imaginative, and endlessly curious. Somewhere along the long road from the African savanna to the modern city, something extraordinary happened. The human brain expanded, language appeared, and consciousness, that strange mirror in which the universe sees itself, began to shine. Scientists have many theories about how this happened. Some point to climate change, tool use, or social cooperation. Others talk about diet, endurance, or fire. But one theory, strange, controversial, and oddly poetic, dares to suggest something far more psychedelic. It is called the Stoned Ape Theory, and it proposes that our minds evolved not just through biology, but through biology altered by chemistry. The theory was popularized by a man named Terence McKenna, an ethnobotanist, philosopher, and let's say enthusiastic psychonaut. He suggested that early humans may have encountered psychedelic mushrooms, specifically those containing psilocybin, and that their consumption played a direct role in the rapid development of our cognition, language, and spirituality. According to McKenna, these ancient experiences didn't just make people hallucinate. They made them think differently. They expanded perception, encouraged communication, and triggered a neurological revolution. Now, before we go further, it's important to remember that this is not mainstream science. You will not find mushroom-induced enlightenment in most anthropology textbooks. But as a thought experiment, it's fascinating because it asks us to reconsider what evolution really means. Was consciousness purely a matter of survival and adaptation? Or could it have been an accident of curiosity? A side effect of taste testing nature's most colorful fungi? Picture the scene. Tens of thousands of years ago, a small group of Homo erectus, or early Homo sapiens, moves across the grasslands of Africa. They are hunter-gatherers, hungry, alert, guided by instinct more than intellect. One day, while following a herd of cattle, they stumble upon a patch of mushrooms growing from dung. Someone, brave or foolish, tries one. The flavor is odd, the texture chewy. And then, slowly, the world begins to change. Colors deepen, sounds shimmer, the stars seem closer, shapes shift and breathe. The mind, once focused on survival, opens like a flower. Patterns appear, not just in the grass or the sky, but in everything. And suddenly, communication becomes easier. The group laughs together, sees together, understands together. Fear gives way to fascination, and for the first time, the world feels alive. According to McKenna, experiences like this may have profoundly rewired the brain. Psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, are known to increase neural connectivity. They make distant regions of the brain talk to each other in ways they normally don't. In modern experiments, this effect is measurable. The boundaries of perception blur and creativity surges. It's as if the brain, normally a strict, bureaucratic office, suddenly throws open all its doors and says, "Let's have everyone talk to everyone else for a while." The results can be chaotic, but also enlightening. Now imagine that happening not to one curious human, but to generations of them. Imagine a tribe that regularly encountered these substances, not as a party drug, but as part of their exploration of nature. They might have discovered patterns in sound that became rhythm, the birth of music. They might have seen visions that became symbols, the birth of art. They might have felt empathy and unity so deeply that the first forms of spirituality emerged. The birth of religion. It sounds romantic, perhaps even absurd. But consider this. Most of the world's oldest rituals, from shamanism to early temple ceremonies, involve altered states of consciousness. Maybe that's not coincidence. McKenna's theory builds on a key observation. Something happened about 100,000 years ago that changed everything. The human brain, which had remained relatively stable for millions of years, suddenly doubled in size over a relatively short evolutionary period. Our ancestors began creating tools, ornaments, and cave art. They buried their dead with ceremony. They began to imagine things that were not there. In other words, the human imagination, that spark of symbolic thinking, switched on. And McKenna wondered, could a fungus have flipped that switch? He proposed several effects of psilocybin that could have shaped evolution. First, at low doses, it enhances visual acuity, meaning it might have helped early hunters detect movement and patterns more effectively. In evolutionary terms, that is a survival advantage. At slightly higher doses, it increases arousal and empathy, strengthening social bonds. Tribes that cooperated better had better chances of survival. And at still higher doses, it dissolves the ego, inspiring spiritual experiences that might have formed the foundation of myth and culture. A mushroom, McKenna argued, might have been the catalyst that turned survival into storytelling. Of course, many scientists raise an eyebrow at this idea. A collective eyebrow, if you will. There's no direct evidence that mushrooms made us human. Fossils don't preserve visions. You can't dig up a piece of prehistoric art and test it for psilocybin residue. But that doesn't mean the theory has no value. Like many of McKenna's ideas, it's less about literal truth and more about metaphorical truth. It invites us to consider that evolution might not be purely mechanical, that consciousness itself could have a creative hand in shaping its own path. And that, frankly, is a far more interesting thought than another diagram of bones and dates. It also reminds us of something often forgotten. The history of humanity is inseparable from the history of plants. Every great shift in our civilization, from agriculture to medicine, from ritual to science, began with a plant. Wheat gave us cities. Coffee gave us industry. And if McKenna is right, mushrooms gave us minds. In that sense, the Stoned Ape Theory is not just a story about drugs. It is a story about symbiosis, nature experimenting through us, to see what it could become. When you think about it, that idea is oddly comforting. It means we are not separate from the ecosystem that birthed us. We are part of its grand experiment, its ongoing conversation between matter and meaning. Maybe the forest wanted to think, and so it made us. Maybe consciousness was never an accident, but an inevitable flowering of biology. And if that's true, then perhaps the real mystery is not how life began, but why it keeps wanting to know itself. When we talk about the Stoned Ape Theory, it's easy to imagine that it belongs to the realm of fantasy, the sort of thing discussed late at night in college dorms, somewhere between cosmic speculation and leftover pizza. But surprisingly, modern neuroscience gives parts of McKenna's story an unexpected echo. To understand why, we first need to talk about what happens in the brain when someone consumes psilocybin, the active compound in many so-called magic mushrooms. Psilocybin itself isn't the psychoactive part. Once it enters the body, the liver converts it into psilocin, which closely resembles serotonin, one of the brain's key neurotransmitters. Serotonin is involved in mood, perception, and cognition. It's like the brain's internal tuning fork, helping neurons communicate harmoniously. When psilocin binds to the brain's serotonin receptors, particularly the 5-HT2A receptors, something unusual happens. The ordinary patterns of neural activity, the tightly controlled circuits that maintain our everyday sense of reality, begin to loosen. The default mode network, the cluster of regions associated with our sense of self, our inner narrative, starts to quiet down. It's as if the little voice in your head that constantly says, I, me, mine, suddenly takes a coffee break. And when that voice quiets, the rest of the brain starts chatting freely. Networks that rarely communicate begin to exchange information. Visual areas link up with auditory regions. Emotional centers connect with abstract reasoning hubs. In the simplest terms, the brain becomes more interconnected. Now, imagine that. But not for one afternoon trip, but across generations of evolving hominids. The neural architecture itself might begin to favor flexibility, creativity, pattern recognition, traits that give survival advantages in a changing world. A brain that can see connections others miss is a brain that can invent tools, read faces, or notice seasonal cycles. It's a poetic idea, but one that rests on real neurobiology. Even in laboratory settings, under scanners that hum like bored wasps, scientists observe that psilocybin promotes entropy in the brain. Not chaos, but freedom. Rigid hierarchies of thought dissolve. The brain stops being a bureaucratic office of specialists and becomes a carnival of conversation. To a neuroscientist, that might sound like a bad day at work. But to evolution, it might be opportunity. After all, creativity is just structured chaos that got lucky. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Modern studies show that psilocybin doesn't only alter perception during the experience. It can change people's perspectives for weeks, months, even years afterward. Participants in clinical studies often describe a lasting sense of connection, openness, and reduced fear of death. In other words, it doesn't just make people trip. It seems to reorganize meaning itself. Now, put yourself in the place of early humans, living in harsh, unpredictable environments, where survival depended not only on strength, but on cohesion, on belief, ritual, and shared imagination. A substance that could temporarily dissolve fear, strengthen social bonds, and inspire a sense of unity with the world might have been more than just a curiosity. It might have been sacred. Many indigenous traditions, even those unrelated by geography, treat psychedelics as entheogens, substances that generate the divine within. The word itself comes from the Greek entheos, meaning the God within. That's not coincidence. Across continents, from the Amazon to the Siberian tundra, shamans and healers have long used altered states of consciousness to access knowledge, healing, and guidance. Whether through mushrooms, peyote, or ayahuasca, they tap into something that modern neuroscience is only beginning to describe: the mind's capacity to rewrite itself. And in that, McKenna's intuition wasn't entirely wrong. Consciousness is plastic. It bends, it expands, it collapses and reforms. The human brain, unlike most others, has a remarkable ability to adapt its own architecture based on experience. The more we learn, the more we think, the more connections we create. In that sense, the Stoned Ape Theory might not be about mushrooms alone, but about what happens when a species becomes aware that it can think differently. Of course, McKenna himself had a flair for exaggeration. He liked to say that the mushroom was an alien intelligence trying to communicate with us, which, scientifically speaking, is a bit like saying your sourdough starter is plotting world peace. But his metaphor wasn't entirely absurd. Fungi are astonishingly complex. They form vast underground networks, called mycelium, that connect entire forests. A wood wide web, as some ecologists affectionately call it. These networks share nutrients, communicate chemical signals, and even warn nearby trees of danger. So when McKenna joked that the mushroom might be the Earth's way of talking to itself, perhaps he was being only half humorous. After all, humans are simply another expression of the planet's creativity. And the fact that certain molecules can make us see reality in fractal geometry and feel boundless love for every leaf and grain of sand suggests that nature has quite a sense of humor herself. And maybe, in some twisted cosmic way, mushrooms are indeed storytellers, just not in words. They speak through experience, through the mind's reshaping. They whisper in the universal language of awe. Still, skepticism is healthy. Scientists point out that correlation is not causation. There is no fossil record of a hallucination, no cave painting with the caption, "This was inspired by eating suspicious mushrooms." And yet, it is hard to ignore that across the planet, ancient humans independently developed rituals around plants and altered consciousness. The evidence may not be written in bone, but it is painted in myth. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Maybe psychedelics did not create consciousness, but they revealed its depth, like turning a flashlight into a prism. They might have shown our ancestors that the world was not just something to survive in, but something to wonder at. That the universe was not dead matter, but alive, interwoven, shimmering with meaning. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. Maybe that was the real evolutionary step. Not the tool, not the fire, not the hunt, but the moment the mind looked at reality and said, "Wait, there's more here than meets the eye." When early humans began to experience the world differently, whether through mushrooms, hunger, or simple wonder, something subtle yet extraordinary began to happen. The mind started making connections not just between sensations, but between ideas. The red of a sunset became linked with blood, with danger, with beauty. The howl of a wolf became not just sound, but symbol. And from that small spark, something new emerged. The human capacity for meaning. If the Stoned Ape Theory has any poetic truth, it lies here. Consciousness evolved when perception became imagination. Our ancestors didn't just see, they began to interpret. And interpretation, that tiny gap between what is and what could be, is where everything human begins. Language, art, myth, morality. Imagine one of these early gatherings, tens of thousands of years ago in the flickering light of a fire. The group sits together after a long day, perhaps still under the subtle influence of those mysterious mushrooms. The night sky stretches overhead, filled with stars, silent, incomprehensible, infinite. Someone, perhaps a woman with a good sense of timing and a dramatic pause, begins to tell a story. She imitates the sound of the wind, gestures toward the fire, and suddenly, the invisible becomes visible. The group leans in, not because they are hungry or afraid, but because for the first time in history, someone has made sense of the world. That moment, when story was born, might have been the first act of philosophy. Before logic, before writing, before cities, there was storytelling. The human attempt to give order to chaos, to bridge the seen and the unseen. In that way, the psychedelic experience wasn't merely about colors and shapes. It was about discovering narrative. A trip, after all, is just a story your brain tells itself in real time. And so, art began. The oldest cave paintings, like those in Lascaux or Chauvet, are not crude doodles. They are symphonies in pigment. Bison, horses, hands, spirals, all moving, layered, alive. To paint them, one must not only see an animal, but imagine it living beyond death, running eternally on the wall. That's not survival behavior. That's symbolic thinking. That's consciousness stretching beyond the moment, reaching toward the eternal. McKenna believed that psychedelics could have accelerated this symbolic revolution, that they allowed early humans to see relationships between things they had never connected before. A sound could become a name. A shape could mean an idea. A gesture could represent gratitude, fear, or love. In short, mushrooms might have turned perception into poetry. There is a certain beauty in that thought, because language, at its core, is just organized hallucination, a way for one brain to project its inner world into another. When I say tree, you do not see my tree, you see yours. But somehow, we agree on the meaning. And that collective agreement, that fragile bridge of shared imagination, is what made civilization possible. Of course, no serious linguist today claims that humans invented grammar while tripping in the savannah. But they do agree that the origins of language are mysterious. It likely began with gestures, then sounds, then symbols. But the why remains elusive. Why did one species suddenly begin naming everything, telling stories, singing to the stars? Maybe, just maybe, because they once saw the world come alive in a way that demanded words. When people talk about psychedelics today, they often describe feelings of connection to nature, to others, to something ineffable and vast. Perhaps those early humans felt the same thing and sought to preserve it through ritual. To recreate the sense of unity, they developed ceremonies. Drumming, dancing, chanting, the burning of herbs. Over time, these practices became religion. What began as personal revelation became shared cosmology. The gods, the heavens, the afterlife, all of it could have started with a simple insight whispered by the forest, that there is more to reality than meets the eye. Anthropologists see echoes of this in every ancient culture. Shamans in the Amazon drink ayahuasca to speak with spirits. Siberian reindeer herders consume the Amanita muscaria mushroom, the red-capped one from fairy tales, to commune with the divine. Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime myths describe ancestral journeys through other worlds, remarkably similar to the psychedelic experience. Across continents, separated by oceans, humanity arrived at the same conclusion: that knowledge is not just something you learn, but something you experience. Even in the ancient Greek world, long after our early ancestors, the Eleusinian mysteries carried that same idea. Each year, initiates would drink a sacred brew called kikeon, whose ingredients remain debated but may have contained ergot, a natural source of LSD-like compounds. Those who underwent the ceremony described visions of death and rebirth, of cosmic unity, of peace beyond words. Sound familiar? It should. because across space and time, the message seems consistent. Reality is wider than perception, and consciousness is the door. Now, none of this means everyone in ancient times was constantly hallucinating their way through history. If that were the case, we'd have cave paintings of dancing refrigerators and flying potatoes. But what it does mean is that altered states, however they were reached, shaped our myths, our art, and our idea of what it means to be human. They reminded us that the mind is not fixed, that reality is not rigid, and that curiosity, even about forbidden fruit or fungi, is what makes us evolve. Because let's face it, curiosity is dangerous. It makes us eat the apple, touch the fire, question the gods, and look under rocks that were probably better left unturned. But it's also the reason we build telescopes, write symphonies, and invent peanut butter. In that sense, the Stoned Ape Theory is not just about drugs. It's about the eternal risk of awareness. Once the mind opens, it can never quite close again. And maybe that's the secret the mushrooms taught us. That consciousness is not a ladder we climbed, but an ocean we fell into. That thinking itself is a psychedelic act, a continuous trip through time, memory, and imagination. And that, whether or not psilocybin shaped our evolution, the desire to explore the unknown, inside or out, is the real force behind our story. As humanity's mind continued to stretch and fold in on itself, much like a very curious brain-shaped origami project, something profound began to form. Organized meaning. The world was no longer just a collection of sensations or instincts. It became a web of symbols. The stars were not just points of light. They were ancestors, stories, gods. Rivers weren't just water. They were veins of the earth, carrying the lifeblood of the planet. This shift from survival to significance marks one of the most important leaps in human history. We began to live not only in nature, but with it, through it, and sometimes, let's be honest, against it. And woven through that change was the thread of altered consciousness. Whether through meditation, fasting, chanting, or, as McKenna suggested, through the occasional encounter with nature's more psychedelic menu options. If you look across early civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, you'll find one pattern repeating. Humans used ritual and symbol to reach beyond themselves. Priests, shamans, mystics, oracles, all seeking contact with something larger, more luminous, more knowing. This universal quest for transcendence might very well be the echo of those first neural fireworks our ancestors experienced long ago. Take ancient Sumer, for example, often considered the cradle of civilization. The temples of Sumer were designed not just as places of worship, but as cosmic ladders connecting heaven and earth. The priests would perform elaborate rituals, accompanied by incense, music, and rhythmic repetition, techniques known even today to alter brain states. They didn't have EEG machines, of course, but they knew the rhythm of the drum could change the rhythm of the mind. Meanwhile, in Egypt, pharaohs were not just kings. They were mediators between worlds. The ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead reads less like a guide to dying and more like a psychedelic travel manual for the soul, full of instructions on how to navigate visions, illusions, and realms of light. Whether through plant concoctions or spiritual training, the goal was the same: to awaken to a higher dimension of being. And in Greece, that birthplace of philosophy and theater, the line between wisdom and revelation was razor thin. Socrates spoke of an inner demon that whispered truth to him. Pythagoras built a religion around mathematics and harmony. And Plato, in his famous allegory of the cave, described enlightenment as a painful yet liberating journey out of illusion into reality. Replace the cave with the trip, and you might find Plato and McKenna nodding in quiet agreement across the millennia. Now, none of these thinkers would have framed their insights in terms of psilocybin molecules binding to serotonin receptors, though that would have made for a fascinating symposium. But they were all exploring the same frontier, the mysterious relationship between mind and world, perception and truth. Why do we experience consciousness at all? Why does the universe seem to look back when we gaze at it deeply enough? And perhaps most interestingly, why does expanding consciousness so often lead to ethics? You see, one of McKenna's less quoted but most important ideas was that psychedelics not only open the mind, they open the heart. He believed that early humans who shared these profound experiences of unity and awe became more empathetic, more cooperative, more creative, and that this emotional intelligence, this sense of we instead of me, might have been just as important for evolution as sharper tools or faster legs. There's some modern science to back that up too. Studies on psychedelics show increased activity in brain regions linked to empathy and reduced fear responses in the amygdala, the brain's ancient alarm system. In simpler terms, the more open the mind, the calmer the monkey. So perhaps, rather than seeing early psychedelics as escapism, we can see them as the first therapy sessions in human history, the dawn of self-awareness, reflection, and group healing. After all, what is therapy but the safe exploration of your own consciousness? And what is a tribe but an early form of group therapy, preferably held around a fire instead of over Zoom? From there, it's a short leap, metaphorically speaking, to religion and morality. When early humans returned from these altered states, they often brought back messages, stories of unity, divine beings, moral laws. Many of the world's sacred texts and rituals echo those same themes: interconnectedness, humility, compassion. The 10 Commandments might not have come from a mushroom trip, but the sense that the universe cares about right and wrong might trace its roots to those early moments of cosmic empathy. And once religion emerged, philosophy soon followed. When people start asking why, it's only a matter of time before someone asks, how do we know what we know? Socrates, Confucius, the Buddha, all in their own way, were exploring consciousness from the inside out. They used dialogue, meditation, and logic as tools, different paths to the same insight. That wisdom begins with self-knowledge. I know that I know nothing, said Socrates, which sounds exactly like what someone might say at the end of a particularly intense evening of contemplation. But the beauty of this evolution, whether spiritual or philosophical, is that it all stems from curiosity, from the desire to see more. And that desire, arguably, is the most psychedelic quality of all: to question the familiar, to step outside of certainty, to embrace paradox without fear. That is what drives both science and mysticism, both mushroom trips and mathematical proofs. The difference is only in method. The mind remains the same. So in a way, the Stoned Ape Theory is not really a story about drugs at all. It's a story about attention, about learning to see the ordinary world as extraordinary, to look at a sunset and realize it's a masterpiece painted by physics, chemistry, and luck. And once you learn to see like that, you don't necessarily need mushrooms anymore. You've already eaten the fruit of knowledge. Still, you can't help but admire the poetic symmetry of it all. That the very plants we evolved alongside might have helped us remember what we already were, nature dreaming of itself. If consciousness was a flame, then language was the breath that made it roar. At some point in that vast expanse of prehistory, long before writing, long before cities, humans discovered something remarkable. Sound could become meaning. It's almost impossible to imagine how that began. Perhaps it started with rhythm, the steady beat of feet on earth, the syncopated pattern of heart and drum, the rise and fall of breath. Every animal can make noise, but only humans turned noise into music and music into speech. Some anthropologists suggest that before there was language, there was song, that communication began as melody, not message. Mothers soothing children, hunters calling through the forest, tribes chanting together beneath the stars. And here's where the Stoned Ape Theory takes a fascinating detour. Psychedelics are known to heighten auditory perception. They blur the line between hearing and seeing, between rhythm and emotion. Colors can feel like sound. Sounds can glow like light. It's called synesthesia, the merging of the senses. For an early human brain, that might have been a revelation. Imagine you're part of a small group on the African plains. You eat a few strange mushrooms that make the world shimmer. The drumbeat around the fire suddenly feels alive, as if it's speaking to you. The people around you begin to hum, to sway, to move in rhythm. And in that rhythm, meaning is born, not in words yet, but in connection. The beat becomes the heartbeat of the tribe. And when the effects fade, you remember the rhythm, even if you can't explain why it mattered. So the next night, you do it again, and again, and slowly. Music becomes a form of memory. Music, in that sense, might be our oldest form of shared consciousness. It doesn't describe the world. It creates it, moment by moment, through vibration and breath. Even today, neuroscientists find that when people sing together, their brainwaves begin to synchronize. Their heart rates align. Their emotions merge. It's as if music temporarily turns many minds into one. That may sound mystical, but it's pure biology. When people act in harmony, literally in harmony, their nervous systems calm. Oxytocin rises, fear falls. In evolutionary terms, that's a perfect recipe for survival. A tribe that sings together stays together. Now imagine what happens when that sense of unity, that rhythmic connection, meets the expanding imagination of a mind shaped by psychedelics. Suddenly, sound becomes symbol. A repeated rhythm could stand for the thunder that follows rain, or for the gallop of prey across the plain. Over generations, these sounds become proto-words, small, musical fragments of meaning. And once language appears, evolution accelerates like wildfire in a dry field. Language allowed ideas to survive longer than memory. It turned thoughts into tools that could outlive their thinkers. And with that, humanity entered a new dimension, the realm of culture. Culture, at its heart, is shared hallucination. It's a collective dream about how the world works, what is sacred, and who we are. And like any good dream, it requires imagination, that uniquely human ability to see what isn't there yet. You can see the remnants of those early dreams in every ancient tradition. The drumming circles of Africa, The trance dances of the Sand People, the chants of the Aboriginal Dreamtime. All ways of tuning consciousness, of stepping beyond the individual mind into something communal, something cosmic. And in that communal state, ideas began to flow freely. Stories of gods, of creation, of meaning. Whether or not mushrooms were present at the fire, the pattern they created remained. A mind reaching beyond itself and finding connection. It's easy to forget that for most of history, humans didn't separate the sacred from the scientific, the magical from the practical. A healer was also a philosopher. A priest was also a botanist. The study of plants, stars, and spirits was one and the same, all attempts to understand how the visible and invisible were woven together. That unity of thought, that sense that everything is connected, may well be the most ancient gift of altered consciousness. Even today, in our world of microscopes and supercomputers, that idea refuses to die. Scientists talk about the interconnectedness of ecosystems, the entanglement of quantum particles, the neural networks that mirror the branching of trees and lightning bolts. The old truth remains. Everything is connected, only now we call it physics. And that brings us back, once again, to the mushrooms. Psilocybin doesn't just dissolve the boundaries between self and other. It reveals the pattern that was there all along. It reminds the brain that separation is an illusion, a useful fiction that helps us navigate daily life, but not the ultimate truth. When those walls drop, even briefly, we feel what mystics and poets have been trying to describe for millennia. Unity. Unity with nature, with others, with the entire strange, unfolding dance of existence. That experience of dissolving, of merging, is often described as the most meaningful event of a person's life, even in controlled clinical settings. And that meaning lasts. Weeks, months, sometimes years later, participants describe being more patient, more open, less afraid. It's as if their internal compass was quietly recalibrated. Now imagine the same happening over generations, not just to individuals, but to communities. That could change everything. It could turn simple tribes into storytelling cultures, ritual societies, early civilizations. In short, it could turn survival into significance. It's worth pausing here to remember that evolution doesn't always happen through bones and genes alone. Sometimes it happens through ideas, through shared beliefs, songs, and symbols that reshape how a species behaves. Cultural evolution can move faster than biology, a kind of mental mutation that spreads not through DNA, but through meaning. So perhaps the Stoned Ape Theory isn't about how mushrooms built the human brain, but how they helped it realize its own potential. How they reminded us that consciousness itself could evolve. And maybe that's why, thousands of years later, we still feel drawn to the unknown, to explore, to experiment, to sit quietly under the stars and wonder why we're here. Because really, we're still the same curious apes, just better dressed and slightly more confused. We've traded the savannah for skyscrapers, the drum circle for Spotify, and yet, deep down, we're still chasing the same feeling. That sense of connection, of mystery, of home in the infinite. As the human mind grew more complex, more capable of imagination, memory, and empathy, something began to shift in the nature of our curiosity. At first, early humans sought understanding through experience. The ecstatic rituals, the chants, the visions brought on by hunger, heat, and sometimes the mysterious fruits of the forest. But over many generations, that same curiosity began to ask quieter, sharper questions. Not just why does lightning strike, but what causes it? Not just who are the gods, but how does the world itself work? It is here, somewhere in the dim borderland between shaman and scholar, that humanity took another step in its long experiment with consciousness. You might say that the first scientist was simply a shaman who stopped dancing long enough to take notes. In those early ages, our ancestors observed patterns everywhere. The changing of the moon, the migration of animals, the return of the rains. And patterns are addictive to a mind that has learned to think symbolically. Once you can see one pattern, you begin to suspect there are more hidden behind the next. A good psychedelic trip, as anyone familiar with the subject might tell you, can make you see patterns in everything, in light, sound, thought, even emotion. For the Stoned Ape Theory, this ability to recognize and abstract patterns may have been one of the earliest benefits of altered consciousness. And what is science, in the end, if not the disciplined pursuit of pattern? Picture one of those early humans, long before recorded history. He sits by a river, watching the ripples spread when a stone falls into the water. Perhaps he remembers another time, another river, the same ripples, and realizes, in a moment of stillness, that this is not coincidence, but cause and effect. He might not have words for it yet, but he has discovered the seed of scientific thinking. In this way, the human mind slowly began to move from mythos to logos, from storytelling to reasoning. The myths did not vanish. They simply evolved. The gods became metaphors, and the rituals became experiments. Where once a shaman painted stars in ochre, a future astronomer would chart them in ink. And yet, the deeper one studies the roots of science, the more one sees how closely it resembles its mystical beginnings. The alchemists of the Middle Ages, for example, were not content with lead and mercury. They were seeking transformation, not only of matter, but of the soul. Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics, spent as much time studying alchemy and theology as he did mathematics. The border between magic and science has always been thin, porous, and shimmering, not unlike the veil between reality and vision in a psychedelic state. What the Stoned Ape Theory suggests, in its most poetic form, is that the original purpose of the mind was not merely survival, but wonder. And from wonder comes both art and analysis, both prayer and proof. The same awe that once made a tribe dance around a fire would, thousands of years later, make Galileo point a telescope at the heavens. And when Galileo did that, when he looked at the moon through glass and saw mountains and shadows where once there had been a goddess, humanity experienced a strange echo of its ancient awakening. It was as if the universe was saying again, "Look closer." That's the paradox of consciousness. The more it understands, the deeper its mysteries become. Every answer births another question. And so, just as early humans followed the sound of thunder to find meaning, modern humans follow the hum of atoms, the shimmer of starlight, the code of DNA. We have changed the scenery, but not the story. Even today, many scientists describe their discoveries with a language that sounds almost mystical. They speak of beauty, elegance, harmony. Physicists talk about the music of the spheres, biologists about the poetry of evolution. When Einstein said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible, he was, in a way, restating the shaman's oldest insight. that mind and cosmos mirror each other. The more one contemplates this, the clearer it becomes that perhaps science and spirituality were never enemies at all, just siblings who took different paths. The Stoned Ape Theory, sitting somewhere in the middle, reminds us that the first great human revelation was not about gods or gravity, but about awareness itself. And awareness is contagious. Once a mind becomes self-aware, it spreads that awareness like fire. One thought sparks another, one idea lights the next. Over thousands of generations, that chain reaction built everything we now call civilization, cities, mathematics, medicine, art. And yes, long-winded lectures like this one. But even as our knowledge grew, something curious persisted. That lingering sense of mystery, the feeling that there's always something just beyond comprehension. You could call it curiosity. You could call it spiritual hunger. McKenna called it the return to the archaic revival. The idea that, despite all our progress, modern humans are still searching for the kind of direct connection with the universe that our ancestors once felt under the influence of those ancient mushrooms. And perhaps that's the final irony. The more rational we become, the more we yearn for meaning. The more information we collect, the more we crave wisdom. It's as if evolution itself is whispering, "Remember what you've forgotten." So maybe the true purpose of human consciousness is not to solve the universe, but to participate in it, to experience it deeply, laugh at its absurdity, and tell stories about the whole strange, beautiful ride. And speaking of stories, it might comfort you to know that, in a cosmic sense, we are still those same curious apes, still staring at the stars, still tasting the unknown, still trying to describe something that will always be just a little too big for words. But then again, if we ever did understand it completely, what would we dream about next? If science was the mind's way of measuring the universe, then myth was its way of feeling it. And in the long story of human thought, those two paths have always intertwined like vines on the same ancient tree. When the early humans first looked up at the stars, they did not see cold spheres of gas burning millions of miles away. They saw stories, hunters chasing prey across the heavens. Lovers turned to constellations, a cosmic order that reflected their own fragile, uncertain world below. This, too, may trace its roots to those early altered states of consciousness. Psychedelics often dissolve the boundary between self and cosmos, between dream and waking life. They make patterns move, symbols breathe, and meaning multiply. In that sense, mythology may have been humanity's first form of philosophy, an intuitive system for organizing the overwhelming mystery of existence. Take, for example, the ancient serpent, a creature that slithers through myths from Africa to the Americas, from India to the Amazon. Sometimes it's a god, sometimes a demon, sometimes the symbol of rebirth itself. Why a serpent? Because, across cultures, people saw it shed its skin and emerge renewed, a perfect metaphor for transformation. And what is a psychedelic experience, if not a temporary shedding of one's psychological skin? To die a little, to be reborn with new eyes. The Stoned Ape Theory suggests that the first humans who tasted these experiences were not merely intoxicated. They were initiated. They glimpsed something bigger than survival, an invisible network of meaning. It wasn't religion yet, but it was the seed of it. Over centuries, these experiences evolved into elaborate mythologies, stories meant to preserve the ineffable. In the ancient world, mystery cults and shamanic traditions flourished. In the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece, initiates drank a potion called kykeon, which many scholars believe contained ergot, a fungus chemically similar to LSD. For 2,000 years, some of the greatest minds of antiquity, from Plato to Aristotle, took part in those secret rites. They never revealed exactly what they saw, only that it was transformative. Plato wrote that after such experiences, one could never again fear death. That sentiment, strikingly enough, mirrors what modern psychedelic research shows today. People who undergo profound psychedelic journeys often describe a reduction in death anxiety, an increased sense of connection, and a feeling of peace. In other words, the ancient intuition might have been correct. Altered consciousness can reshape not only perception, but one's entire relationship with existence. And yet, as civilizations grew more organized, these mystical practices began to fade from public life. Religion became institutionalized. Myth hardened into doctrine. What was once direct experience became second-hand belief. The living mystery turned into written scripture. Beautiful, yes, but also fixed, confined by language and hierarchy. The irony, of course, is that most of the great founders of religions, prophets, saints, and sages, had experiences that sound suspiciously like mystical visions. Whether through fasting, isolation, meditation, or sheer inspiration, they tapped into something beyond the everyday mind. And while historians debate the sources of those visions, the human pattern remains. From the mushroom to the mountaintop, from the desert to the dream, people have always sought to see more than what is visible. The Stoned Ape Theory doesn't claim that religion came from psychedelics. It simply suggests that the capacity for transcendence, that hunger for meaning, that openness to wonder, may have been shaped by those ancient neural awakenings. Once consciousness learns to look beyond itself, it never quite forgets how. And as history unfolded, that hunger kept reinventing itself. In medieval Europe, it appeared as mystical Christianity, monks and visionaries seeing divine light in silence. In India, it took the form of meditation and yoga. In the Americas, it lived on in indigenous rituals using peyote, ayahuasca, and psilocybin. Ceremonies still practiced today. Different languages, same longing, to touch the infinite. But of course, the story doesn't end in temples or jungles. In the 20th century, after centuries of rationalism, the world began to rediscover what the ancients had always known, that the mind itself is a vast frontier. And it took a handful of curious scientists, poets, and misfits to remind everyone. In the 1950s and 1960s, figures like Aldous Huxley, Timothy Leary, and Ram Dass began to explore psychedelics once again, not as heresy, but as inquiry. They spoke of expanding consciousness, of transcending ego, of reconnecting with nature and humanity. For a brief, chaotic moment, it seemed as though the species was remembering its own origin story. And then, predictably, came the backlash. Governments banned the substances. Society recoiled from its own reflection. The great experiment went underground, waiting, like a seed in winter, for its time to return. And now, decades later, that time has come. Modern neuroscience has re-entered the conversation, this time with brain scanners and double-blind studies instead of feathers and drums. The results are striking. Under psilocybin, regions of the brain that normally dominate, the so-called default mode network, quiet down, This allows other regions to communicate more freely, creating a state of fluid, global connectivity. It's a measurable echo of what mystics have always described: the dissolution of self, the feeling of unity. The same chemistry that once shaped our ancestors' perception may soon shape our therapy, our healing, even our understanding of consciousness itself. And that brings us full circle. Because if the Stoned Ape Theory is even partly true, then we are not merely studying psychedelics. We are remembering them. We are peering back into our own evolutionary past, to the moment when the human mind first opened its eyes and said, "I am aware." Funny, isn't it? After hundreds of thousands of years, millions of words, countless experiments, we're still chasing the same mystery our ancestors found in a field of glowing mushrooms. The tools have changed, but the wonder has not. If the Stoned Ape Theory is, at its heart, a story about awakening, then the next question is this: what happens when the species that awakened begins to realize it can shape its own evolution? That, perhaps, is where we now stand. For most of history, humans were shaped by nature, by hunger, weather, predators, and chance. Now, for the first time, nature is being shaped by humans. Through technology, medicine, and information, we have become the gardeners of our own genetic garden. And in doing so, we may be replaying the same drama that began when those first curious apes looked at a strange mushroom and thought, "What if I try this?" Think about it. The leap from primitive cognition to self-awareness may have been the first moment that evolution turned inward, when life became aware of itself as life. Today, we are witnessing the next leap. Consciousness studying consciousness. Mind recreating mind through artificial intelligence, neurotechnology, and biotechnology. In a way, humanity has become the mushroom. We are the next agent of transformation, altering the environment, reshaping perception, and experimenting with awareness in ways no species has done before. Now, depending on your mood, that can sound either thrilling or terrifying. The same curiosity that once drove us to paint on cave walls has built nuclear weapons, social media algorithms, and machines that can dream. Our intelligence is both miracle and hazard, a double-edged sword forged in the fires of imagination. And so, as modern humans return to exploring psychedelics, many scientists and thinkers are quietly wondering, could these substances help guide that transformation responsibly? Could they, once again, act as the gentle hand that reminds us that intelligence without empathy is dangerous, and that awareness without humility becomes madness? When researchers at Johns Hopkins or Imperial College study psilocybin today, they do not speak of getting high. They speak of neural plasticity, ego dissolution, and spiritual integration. What they are really studying is the mystery of being itself, the oldest human question dressed in a lab coat. And in that sense, modern neuroscience is not so far from ancient shamanism. Both are attempts to heal the split between mind and nature, between the self and the cosmos. Perhaps that's the quiet genius of the Stoned Ape Theory. It reminds us that our species was never meant to be a machine of pure logic. We were born of rhythm, vision, laughter, and awe. To evolve further, we may have to remember the art of wonder. Imagine for a moment a future where consciousness is treated not as a byproduct of biology, but as the sacred fabric of reality itself. In such a world, exploring the mind would be as natural as exploring space. Children would learn not only history and mathematics, but also mindfulness, compassion, and self-inquiry. Technology would be built not to addict, but to awaken. It sounds utopian, perhaps even naive. But so did language once. So did fire. Every great human invention began as something irrational, as a leap into the unknown. And every time, the leap was guided by curiosity, that ancient whisper in our DNA saying, "What if?" It's worth noting that Terence McKenna, the philosopher behind the Stoned Ape Theory, never meant his ideas to be taken as rigid science. He spoke in poetry, in metaphor, in the language of possibility. He invited us to think not just about mushrooms, but about the story of consciousness itself. To see evolution not as a ladder, but as a symphony. Each note, from the first neuron to the modern mind, part of one vast, unfolding song. And yet, McKenna also warned of imbalance. He said that when a species forgets its connection to the planet, it risks self-destruction. He described modern humanity as half angel, half ape, torn between transcendence and instinct, between technology and nature. Our challenge, he believed, is to reunite the two. Dry humor aside, he wasn't wrong. For all our progress, the world is still full of division, distraction, and disconnection. We have more information than ever, but less wisdom. More communication, but less understanding. We live surrounded by glowing screens, yet we've forgotten how to sit under the stars. And so, the return of psychedelic research, of curiosity about consciousness itself, may be nature's way of nudging us back toward balance. Just as those ancient apes once stumbled upon a vision that expanded their minds, we may be stumbling toward a new kind of awareness, one that includes both science and soul, both data and dream. In that sense, the Stoned Ape Theory is less about the past and more about the future. It suggests that evolution is not over. It's ongoing, and we are active participants in it. Every act of creativity, every moment of empathy, every quiet realization that I am not separate from the world is part of that evolution. And if that's true, then the story of humanity is still being written, neuron by neuron, thought by thought. We may never know for sure whether our ancestors truly found enlightenment in a mushroom field. But we do know this. They found something that made them look up at the stars and wonder. And that wonder, that spark, is still alive in us, in art, in science, in laughter, in love. It's what drives us to explore, to create, to tell stories like this one. So perhaps the lesson of the Stoned Ape Theory isn't about drugs or even evolution. It's about remembering that awareness itself is the greatest adventure there is, and that the mind, fragile, funny, fearless, is the ship that carries us through it. If you think about it long enough, consciousness, evolution, and the vastness of time, you begin to realize something almost paradoxical. Perhaps evolution did not create consciousness. Perhaps consciousness creates evolution. It sounds like a riddle, but let's unpack it slowly. When Charles Darwin first described natural selection, he gave the world a story of life that was both beautiful and humbling. Random mutations shaped by survival sculpted the endless forms of life on Earth. But Darwin's theory, as profound as it was, looked only at the surface, at the visible. It explained how species changed, but not why awareness itself appeared. Why should a lump of matter over time begin to feel, to see, to dream? If the Stoned Ape Theory adds anything to this grand picture, it's a reminder that evolution might not only be about bones and genes, but also about mind. that somewhere along the line, consciousness began not just to observe evolution, but to guide it. Picture an early human community sitting around a fire. Their lives are short, their world is small, and yet, in the flicker of that flame, imagination sparks. One of them carves a figure out of bone, another paints a bison on the wall, another hums a melody that no one has ever heard before. None of these acts help them survive directly. They don't make the hunt easier or the winter shorter. But they feed something else. The mind's hunger for meaning. And meaning, it turns out, is a powerful survival tool. A creature that believes its life has purpose fights harder to live. A tribe that tells stories cooperates more deeply. An individual who can imagine the future can plan, adapt, endure. In this way, consciousness becomes its own evolutionary force. The species that learned to dream became the species that learned to build. Now, what the Stoned Ape Theory proposes is that psychedelic experiences might have accelerated this process, that they temporarily lifted the mind out of its habitual loops, revealing patterns of connection that ordinary perception could not see. And once those neural pathways opened, they never fully closed again. Each generation inherited not the hallucinations, but the potential. A slightly more elastic brain, a slightly deeper sense of self. Neuroscientists today might describe this as an increase in complexity, the brain evolving toward higher levels of integration and flexibility. Philosophers, on the other hand, might call it the universe waking up to itself. Both, in their own way, are saying the same thing. Consciousness is not an accident. It's the point. If you trace the history of life from a single cell to the human mind, you see an unmistakable direction. From simplicity to awareness. The first cell could only react. The first animal could perceive. The first human could reflect. And reflection changed everything. It allowed us to ask questions that no other creature could. What is death? What is truth? What is love? These questions have no survival value, and yet they define us. A tiger never writes poetry. A dolphin never builds a cathedral. But humans, fragile, hairless, often confused humans, cannot stop creating symbols, rituals, art, and philosophy. It's almost as if the universe, through us, is trying to understand itself. Carl Sagan once said, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." That simple sentence captures the essence of this idea. The Stoned Ape Theory merely extends it backward in time, suggesting that our capacity for introspection and awe might have been sparked by those early encounters with nature's most mysterious teachers. And if that's true, then consciousness and evolution are not separate stories. They are one continuous conversation. Life learning about life. Matter dreaming about itself. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some scientists find the Stoned Ape Theory too poetic, too speculative. And they're right. It's hard to prove what went on in the minds of our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago. There are no fossils of thoughts, no stone tools of imagination. But that's also what makes the theory so enchanting. It invites us to fill in the gaps with wonder. Even skeptics, if they're honest, will admit that something extraordinary happened in the human brain, a leap that no other species has taken. Our prefrontal cortex expanded, our language exploded, our art flourished. The change was too sudden, too dramatic to be easily explained by simple survival pressure. Something ignited our inner world, and the fire has never gone out. When you think about it this way, evolution becomes less of a mechanical process and more of a grand improvisation. Nature tries fails, adapts, and dreams. And sometimes, the dreamers are us. And maybe that's the true legacy of those ancient stoned apes. They began to see the world not only as a place to survive, but as a mystery to contemplate. They began to feel not only hunger, but curiosity, not only fear, but reverence. Curiosity and reverence, two sides of the same evolutionary coin. Without curiosity, there is no science. Without reverence, there is no soul. And when both exist together, humanity becomes something new. A creature capable of both logic and love, both intellect and imagination. In that sense, perhaps the Stoned Ape Theory is not about drugs at all. It's about balance, about remembering that the human story is not only a struggle for survival, but a search for meaning. When we meditate, when we make art, when we laugh, or when we sit quietly under the night sky, we are continuing that search. We are participating in evolution, one thought at a time. And perhaps, somewhere in the quiet corners of the universe, consciousness itself smiles, amused, patient, watching its own reflection unfold across time. If evolution is the story of life, learning to look at itself, then modern civilization is the moment when that reflection became infinite. A mirror reflecting another mirror, consciousness studying its own reflection. When our ancestors first painted on cave walls, they were not simply documenting what they saw. They were performing an act of transformation. A handprint on stone was more than pigment. It was a statement of awareness. It said, I was here. I exist. I can shape the world with thought. That gesture, made tens of thousands of years ago, was the first whisper of what we now call technology, the extension of the mind into matter. Today, that same impulse lives on, not in ochre and charcoal, but in light and code. Every time we type, record, or share, we are still leaving traces of consciousness, new handprints on the digital cave walls of the internet. Humanity, it seems, has never stopped painting. We have only changed our brushes. Technology, in this sense, is a continuation of the psychedelic experience. Where the sacred mushroom once expanded the boundaries of perception, technology now expands the boundaries of connection. It links minds across continents, thoughts across cultures, dreams across generations. In a strange and modern way, the internet has become our collective nervous system, a shimmering network of neurons made not of flesh, but of fiber and light. At any given moment, billions of human thoughts are pulsing through it, signals of joy, fear, curiosity, and memory. It is the largest experiment in shared consciousness the Earth has ever seen. But like all experiments, it is unpredictable. Connection does not automatically lead to understanding. Information does not always lead to wisdom. We have created a mind that spans the planet, yet we are still learning how to think together. Sometimes it feels as though humanity has given birth to a young and volatile deity, a god made of algorithms and desire, still learning the difference between love and addiction. Artificial intelligence, too, can be seen as part of this same evolutionary dance. In a way, it is the logical extension of the Stoned Ape Theory. Once, consciousness expanded through biology, through the brain's encounter with nature. Now, it expands through creation itself. Humanity is building a new form of awareness, a mirror made of silicon that reflects our own thoughts back at us. And like the mushroom, it forces us to ask unsettling questions. What is intelligence? What is self? What does it mean to know something? when a machine writes a poem or paints a picture? Is it creating or only imitating? When it speaks, are we hearing its mind, or only our own voices echoed back in 1,000 new patterns? In some ways, these questions are not new. They are ancient. They are the same questions our ancestors must have asked when they first saw visions under the influence of sacred plants. What am I seeing? They must have wondered. Is this real? Or is it me? And just as the mushrooms blurred the line between the inner and the outer world, so does technology blur the boundary between human and machine. The screen has become a new kind of mirror, one that stares back. There is both beauty and danger in that. We have built tools powerful enough to model the human mind, but not yet wise enough to model the human heart. Our inventions grow faster than our ability to understand them, and perhaps that too is part of evolution. The chaos before a new equilibrium. It's tempting to think that technology separates us from nature, but the truth may be the opposite. Every circuit, every microchip, every glowing pixel is made of minerals drawn from the earth, powered by sunlight captured long ago. The digital is not a break from nature. It is nature in disguise, the universe reorganizing itself into new patterns of thought. Perhaps the Stoned Ape Theory was never about mushrooms at all. Perhaps it was about feedback loops, nature using living systems to reflect on itself, first through chemistry, now through circuitry. The psychedelic experience opened the mind to the interconnectedness of life. The digital experience, at its best, can do the same. It shows us that we are nodes in a vast and living network, every thought a signal, every action a ripple in the collective mind of Earth. Of course, that vision depends on how we use it. The internet can be a temple or a trap. Artificial intelligence can amplify wisdom or illusion. Like the mushroom, technology reveals what already lives inside us. If our consciousness is clear, it magnifies understanding. If it is clouded, it magnifies confusion. In that way, the evolution of technology mirrors the evolution of the self. Both demand awareness, humility, and care. The mushroom asked the ape to wake up to its place in the universe. The algorithm asks the modern human to wake up to its own reflection. It is easy to dismiss these parallels as poetic fancy. But consider this. Both the psychedelic experience and the technological revolution are attempts to transcend limitation, to expand what the mind can perceive, create, and connect. One does it through chemistry, the other through computation. Both, in their own way, are expressions of the same ancient urge, the desire to become more than we are. And yet, just as those ancient apes needed to integrate their visions to survive, so must we. To evolve is not simply to see more, it is to understand more. Otherwise, vision becomes illusion, and awareness becomes noise. Maybe that's why silence feels so important now. In a world where every sound, image, and idea is instantly accessible, silence becomes sacred again, a rare space where consciousness can hear itself think. The mushroom once gave our ancestors that pause, that breath between the noise of survival and the whisper of meaning. Today, we might find it not in the jungle, but in turning off the screen. And when we do, when we sit quietly, breathe deeply, and let the world fade into stillness, something ancient awakens again. The same awareness that looked out through the eyes of those first curious apes looks out through ours. The same pulse of wonder, the same gentle humor, the same fragile brilliance. In that sense, Nothing has changed. The tools are different, the landscape is digital, the fire burns in pixels instead of logs. But the question is the same. Who are we? And how far can consciousness go in knowing itself? If science is the language of explanation, then spirituality is the language of experience. And when we talk about the Stoned Ape Theory, we find ourselves standing right on the bridge between the two. You see, the story of consciousness, of how awareness arose and expanded, cannot be told only through biology. Biology can describe the structure of the brain, the chemistry of neurotransmitters, the electrical storms of perception. But it cannot capture what it feels like to be alive. It cannot measure awe. It cannot quantify a revelation. This is where the spiritual dimension quietly enters, not as a rejection of science, but as its companion. The ancient and the modern mind, walking side by side, both trying to understand the same mystery from different directions. When those early humans first consumed psychedelic mushrooms, they did not have words like psilocybin or neuroplasticity. To them, it must have felt like touching the divine. The forest came alive, the stars whispered, the boundaries between self and world dissolved. They must have believed, in their innocent brilliance, that the spirits of nature were speaking to them. And perhaps, in a sense, they were right. Because what we call spiritual experience is, at its core, a direct encounter with reality, stripped of ego, stripped of the filters that separate observer and observed. In that state, a human does not see the forest. They are the forest. They do not hear the wind. They are the wind. For a mind that had just begun to form language, this merging must have been earth-shattering. It is one thing to know that you exist. It is another to feel that you are part of everything that exists. That experience of unity, of belonging, might have been the first spark of what later became religion. Over time, those raw experiences of transcendence evolved into myth and ritual. The visions became stories, and the stories became teachings. Across the world, from the shamans of Siberia to the priests of Egypt to the mystics of India, we find echoes of the same realization, that beneath the surface of reality lies something vast, intelligent, and interconnected. The Stoned Ape Theory, then, can be seen not only as a hypothesis about evolution, but as a meditation on meaning. It suggests that psychedelics didn't simply help us survive. They helped us remember that survival is not enough. They opened the door to what psychologists now call the mystical experience. The sense that life is one vast organism, endlessly creating and observing itself. And what's fascinating is that modern science, in its own cautious way, is starting to circle back to the same insights. Neuroscientists studying the effects of psilocybin on the brain have found that during a psychedelic experience, the usual boundaries between brain regions begin to dissolve. The default mode network, the system that generates the sense of a separate self, quiets down. The mind becomes fluid again, open, interconnected, less about me and more about we. In other words, the brain stops narrating and starts being. It's a state remarkably similar to what monks and mystics have described for thousands of years through meditation, prayer, and ecstatic vision. It's as if the brain has built-in doors to transcendence. And psychedelics, meditation, or art are simply different keys that open them. When we think about the Stoned Ape Theory in that light, it becomes less about drugs and more about destiny. It tells us that evolution is not only physical, but spiritual. That consciousness is reaching for higher forms of understanding through every means available. There is something almost poetic about that idea. That the same molecules that sprout from the soil might have lifted the human mind toward the stars. That chemistry and divinity might be two sides of the same cosmic equation. And if that feels too grand, consider this. In every religion, there is a moment where a human being encounters something beyond comprehension. A burning bush, a blinding light, a voice in the silence. The words change, the metaphors differ, but the essence is always the same. An overwhelming sense that we are not alone. What the Stoned Ape Theory adds is not contradiction, but context. It reminds us that these moments of revelation are not supernatural. They are natural. They are part of the same evolutionary story that produced our eyes, our hands, our laughter. The divine, if it exists, may not be separate from nature at all. It may be nature awakening through us. And that, in a way, is the most humbling and hilarious truth of all. Because after all the grand temples, after all the sacred chants and holy wars, we might discover that enlightenment began not in heaven, but in a cow field, with a few curious apes eating mushrooms and accidentally discovering God. It's funny, isn't it? The entire trajectory of human spirituality might trace back to a moment of curiosity and courage, or perhaps hunger. The line between the sacred and the silly is thinner than we think. But that too is part of our beauty. The same creature that builds cathedrals also tells jokes. The same mind that contemplates eternity also trips over its own feet. We are divine fools, half God, half animal, stumbling our way through the cosmos with equal measures of wonder and confusion. And maybe that's exactly how it's supposed to be. Because in our clumsy searching, we keep discovering truth. In our laughter, we find humility. In our awe, we find love. When we realize that consciousness and the cosmos are not separate, that the universe is dreaming itself awake through our eyes, everything changes. The world stops being a collection of things and becomes a living network of relationships. Every tree, every river, every breath becomes sacred again. That, perhaps, is what the Stoned Ape Theory was always pointing toward. Not a scientific claim, but an invitation. A reminder that the mind, when open, can still see the divine shimmering quietly within the ordinary. If the story of the Stoned Ape Theory began in the forest, perhaps it ends in the theater of the mind, where imagination becomes art and art becomes memory. When early humans looked up at the stars after eating those strange, luminous mushrooms, they must have felt something stirring inside them, an awareness too large to contain, too mysterious to describe. And so they began to translate it, not into equations, but into rhythm, into sound, into pattern. Art, in its purest form, is consciousness trying to understand itself. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the stoned ape, not the hallucination, but the language that grew out of it. The first human songs were not written. They were breathed. Simple hums that echoed through caves, carried by firelight. A melody without words, rising and falling like a heartbeat. From those hums came chants, from chants came prayers, and from prayers came poetry, each a bridge between the visible and the invisible. And music, that strange magic of vibration, may well have been our first form of shared transcendence. Long before philosophy or theology, there was the drum, steady, primal, unifying. When the rhythm pulsed through a tribe, separate selves dissolved into one body. The drumbeat was both medicine and message, a reminder that life itself moves in patterns, that the body and the earth dance to the same tempo. Could say that every symphony ever written, every love song, every lullaby still carries an echo of that first rhythm. The sound of awareness discovering itself. Then came language, that most delicate of miracles. The ability not just to feel, but to name what we feel. To take the infinite chaos of experience and weave it into meaning. No other species has done that quite the same way. Words turned sensation into story, and story turned memory into history. Language allowed humans to share their inner worlds. A dream could become a tale. A vision could become a teaching. A single metaphor could survive for generations, outliving the one who spoke it. Through language, consciousness gained immortality. And with that, culture was born. Art became the mirror in which humanity could see its own soul. And the Stoned Ape Theory, in this light, becomes not just an explanation of how our brains grew, but of why we began to create. When the mind expands, it does not stop at perception. It begins to express. Those early psychedelic insights, the shimmering unity of life, the dissolving of ego, the awe before mystery, needed form. So humans carved them into stone, painted them on walls, sang them into the air, and later wrote them into sacred texts and philosophical dialogues. The entire history of art, in some sense, is a long echo of that first revelation, that there is more to existence than survival. Even now, when you listen to music that moves you to tears, or gaze at a painting that feels older than time, you're touching that same current. The same timeless pulse that once guided the hand of a prehistoric artist is still humming inside your nervous system. The molecules may differ, the tools may change, but the source, that spark of awareness, remains the same. It's humbling, really, to realize that the drive to create, to express love, sorrow, faith, or confusion, may have begun as a side effect of a mushroom's chemistry. And yet, from that small accident of nature came Shakespeare and Mozart, Van Gogh and Maya Angelou. The entire arc of human culture, from cave paintings to cathedrals, from tribal chants to digital symphonies, might trace back to a few apes who, one evening, decided to taste the unknown. If that isn't divine irony, I don't know what is. But perhaps the universe itself has a sense of humor. It spends billions of years shaping stars and planets, and then one day, on a small blue world, it discovers laughter. Through us. The Stoned Ape Theory, then, is not just about evolution. It's about participation. It reminds us that we are not separate observers of life, but part of its ongoing creation. The cosmos didn't stop unfolding after the Big Bang. It continues through thought, through art, through us. Every time we imagine, every time we wonder, every time we love, we are continuing the work that began in those ancient forests. And that means the story is not finished. Evolution never ends. It simply changes form. Perhaps one day, far in the future, our descendants, whatever shape they take, will look back at us and smile. They'll see that consciousness grew not just through survival, but through curiosity, beauty, and play. They'll see that the great experiment of awareness was never about control, but about connection. Maybe they will understand that every painting, every song, every whisper of philosophy was the universe finding new ways to say the same simple truth. I am alive, So tonight, as you rest, you can let that truth settle gently in your mind, that you are part of that long and luminous story, that every thought you've ever had, every dream you've ever carried, is another brushstroke in the masterpiece of existence. You don't have to search for meaning. You are meaning, walking, breathing, remembering, dreaming. A child of the forest and the stars. An echo of the first mind that dared to awaken. So close your eyes now. Feel the ancient rhythm in your breath, the same rhythm that guided those early apes, that shaped songs and languages and civilizations. You are part of it still. The story of consciousness is still unfolding through you, quietly, beautifully, endlessly. And if you listen closely enough, beneath the hum of your thoughts, you might hear it, the soft laughter of the universe, amused and amazed by its own creation. Good night.